And that's how the corporate credentials are breached.
Hello and welcome to Episode 6, Season 1 of your Cyber Threat Intelligence podcast. Whether you're a seasoned CTI expert, a cybersecurity professional, or simply curious about the digital battlefield, our expert guests and host will break down complex topics into actionable insights. On this episode of Season 1, our host, Pedro Kertzman, will chat with Aaron Roberts. Aaron is a cyber threat intelligence expert, specialized in open source intelligence, with experience across the UK public and private sectors, the military, and founding member of the UK OSINT community. As the founder of Prospective Intelligence and author of Cyber Threat Intelligence, the no-nonsense guide for CISOs and Security Managers, Aaron helps organizations strengthen their security posture through practical training and intelligence-led approaches. Over to you, Pedro.
Aaron, thanks so much for coming to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Pedro. It's great to be here.
Awesome. And I usually start asking the guests about their journey to CTI. Would you mind walking us through that, please?
Yeah. So back in the land before, I'd say ubiquitous internet, I'd always been interested in like computers and stuff growing up, mostly because of video games, probably like a lot of CTI analysts. And then as I was growing up, trying to figure out what to do in my life, I decided that I wanted to be a football coach, which is not very cyber, is not very intelligence analyst, is very far removed from that. I guess there is some data analysis involved, but very different world. So I went to university and started studying about sports and coaching and thinking this is a good route to go down, and there's like a good career and something I'm interested in down the road. Until you find out, particularly in the UK and probably in most developed nations where like football is a big deal, or soccer, as you might call it in the US, it turns out it's more who you know rather than what you could learn like through like a formal degree. And I think that's something where a lot of people probably make this realization as they're growing up, and an idea of I've got a degree in this thing, so therefore I can now be a person over here doing this subject is very, very different from in like perceptions versus reality. So whilst through university, I was not really enjoying the course. It wasn't really what I'd anticipated it being anyway. And it effectively came down to a point where I'd seen local government department had advertised like for vacancies, and I always assumed, like, when growing up, watched a lot of 24 and bad quality action movies, and thinking I could do that. I want to be a spy. Let's don't do that. And I'm thinking, out of curiosity, how far could I get in this process? Thinking I would, probably not even get paper sifted to an interview, let alone anything else. But the long story short is I somehow managed to talk myself into a job. And so I was working in civil service in the UK initially as an IT support analyst. So, effectively like level 1 support, answering phone calls, diagnosing problems, and either, using like known fixes or trying to work the issue out, and then either subsequently resolving the problem or passing on to like deeper technical support. And that gave me a really good foundational knowledge around like operating systems and computers, and to a lesser extent I would say networking, because most of the network issues you just have to pass on because you either don't have the right access to tools, or you just you don't have that level of knowledge to be able to resolve them. And from there I sort of came to the end of that post and was looking for the next move, and then I transitioned into like more of a cybersecurity role, which was less technical in terms of like resolving issues and understanding like day to day what was happening in different situations, but it put me in a much more customer facing role. So I would interface with different government departments, private sector as well, and understand and anticipate the questions they would be asking about things. A lot of that would come down from like potentially like government guidance or things in the news. So if that's like new vulnerabilities or a rampant form of malware, and we're talking back in like 2012, so the biggest things really were like banking trojans and things like that at the time, game over Zeus and stuff like that. So that role was really interesting for me because I got to be sort of sit in the middle between relatively senior but non-technical audience, which were mostly like the people I would consider to be customers, versus the technical goblins behind me, where I'd be going to like kind of get the real answers from them to understand the issues, and then taking like the technical aspects of what they had to say and then trying to put it into language that the others could understand. And then from there, that's kind of, I did that for a couple of years, and then I got the opportunity to pivot into a different team where I got to focus on open source intelligence. So, and I think that's really where like my sort of cyber journey really, I would say, really kicked on.
Okay.
So I got to use a combination of all those skills. So, relationship management, interfacing with different partners, internationally and like nationally, bit of like project management and stuff. So over long-term piece of work, but also working across like such a broad range of different subject areas. So effectively learning how to do what I call nowadays called OSINT. And that would be, we could be talking about individuals, we might be talking about, infrastructure, might be specific websites, or it might be, certain platforms, and sort of trying to figure out what information can we find out about them. How do we turn that into like a useful intelligence product for the end customer? And invariably, a lot of that was, sensitive work, but geared around how can we leverage data from the internet to inform other decisions. And a lot of that work involved like looking at different, groups and different organizations. Some of it involved, what we now call like APTs and things like that. And that could be anything from like infrastructure that they had used in cyber attacks versus, potentially like individuals that are suspected of being in those groups. So at the time, I think the term cyber threat intelligence hadn't really been like coined as such.
Yeah.
It was effectively just a new type of information that was pretty much derived from open source information. So I think even OSINT as a term was probably maybe not even like common lexicon to say.
Interesting.
And then after doing that for a few years, made a decision to leave the government and move to the private sector. So that was like a big decision. But I think it was only with hindsight, it was only really a big decision to move because the market, like the CTI space, was pretty new then and pretty misunderstood. I think you could go from one company to the next and they would have very, very different ideas about what CTI is.
Yeah.
And what CTI analysts do and how they should work. And I think that's probably still true today, right? To some degrees.
Yeah.
But that sort of decision there was when I started looking at like what opportunities actually exist outside of like this public sector bubble. And, the UK market is definitely significantly smaller than the US. And I'm not so sure about other like Western nations, but I think the UK is definitely like always seems like we're lagging behind in terms of like the number of opportunities, the breadth of the roles, or the necessary demand for certain specialisms, which is always frustration. Is part of the reason why we formed like the UK OSINT community as well last year. But to bring us back to your initial question about CTI. So I made that decision to move to the private sector, and when I was looking at roles, I was looking for anything that sort of mentioned like open source intelligence research, like investigations, and invariably like you'd see roles looking for like cyber analysts and cyber intelligence, or it'd be like SOC analysts, but you're really good at Google, like because the market was pretty immature then, I think. So I ended up working for a company called Eclectic IQ, which are a Dutch threat intelligence firm that have their own platform, a threat intelligence platform. And I joined what was called at the time the Eclectic IQ Fusion Center. So our role as threat intelligence analysts was to collate information from all the different sources that we could ingest and turn that into like structured intelligence using Sticks one at the time.
Okay.
And effectively turning it into useful intelligence that you could then send to the customer, and then they would be able to sort of understand like the whole picture of things from all the different vendors that they subscribe to.
Like enriching the information that you got in the first place.
Yeah, so it was a combination of like you might do your own research on something, whether it's like, you know, an incident that's occurred, or you might just be researching like certain types of infrastructure or certain threat actor. Or you might be going, right, okay, well, what do like, let's say CrowdStrike say about this actor? What do Mandiant say about this actor? And then what other sources do we have? And you might pull from like something like Alien Vault or, you know, URL House, and you like sort of correlate this information together and enrich it, and sort of pivot from those different bits of information to then provide like a report and say, well, this is what each like vendor has to sort of say about this. This is our assessment on this, and then it's up to you as a customer, like what you want to do with that information. And I feel that was it was a different like way of approaching the situation from my experience, but it was also, I think, really, really useful because it was a great exposure to different cyber vendors, like, and seeing like how they provide information, how they report on things, insights into like their visibility, and also from the different range of customers as well. You can sort of see, like, try and figure out what their priorities were and the things they cared about, and also just, you know, like how much money they had as well, a little bit. I think that was sort of like a really interesting, like, baptism of fire a little bit into like what CTI is in like real life. And I think the vendor space is always interesting because unless you've been in that environment as a defender or blue team or part of a cybersecurity function, you wouldn't necessarily understand what the customer wants. And I think this always comes down to that thing, right, where like not having like a priority list of intelligence requirements is like one of the fundamental things you should do as a threat intelligence team, like regardless of where the organization, because you need to understand what the people that read your reports, what they want to be reading about. And I think, especially at that time, I think you would occasionally get a bit guilty of like researching something that we thought was cool. You're like, oh, have you seen like APT28 did this? Oh, let's go. Let's write a report about that. Oh, it's amazing. And then invariably you'd be like, yeah, but we read about that on Bleeping Computer already, so why do we care? It's like, it looks pretty in your little graph and like the visuals are nice, but like invariably hasn't really helped us further our security any. So I think after doing that for, I think it was about 18 months I worked there. That's where I moved to a telco in the UK and sort of went in with the idea of like, you know, critical national infrastructure, very interesting environment, getting attacked daily basis. And sort of having this exposure to real like tete-a-tete cyber operations, like attack, defend. And whilst that didn't really work out for me, to be honest, I was only there for about 6 months. I think it just ended up with, they'd basically brought into a platform that needed a lot of management and a lot of oversight. And unfortunately, just the way it worked was, you know, like our support team was like on one part of the world, the vendor was on the west coast of the US, we're in the middle, and we're just like trying to get either somebody on a call, trying to understand something, and it was just so very difficult. And it sort of went into a space where like you're kind of doing like project management and IT support without any of the right tools to really enable that. So I ended up like talking to a friend who was hiring, and he took me around over a beer, which is probably quite easy to do in all honesty. He was like, come work with me. I was like, come on, let's have a chat. But then, so I moved from Vodafone to Sky, which is predominantly a television media broadcasting company, but they also do they also run their own broadband service. They run landline telephones, and they have a mobile network operator as well, which it's a very interesting environment. So they have everything from content piracy, user account fraud, the fact they're a big company as well with lots of money going into things like sports rights. So they're a very clear target for ransomware groups and stuff like that. Very interesting environment. Really exciting place to work as well, because there was always stuff happening which whilst not directly part of your job, just seeing oh, the company's just done this, or we've announced this, and we've got this thing going on, and then you're just walking around the office, and you see people from the TV just having their lunch and stuff. It's very weird in a lot of ways, but that was a really interesting setup as well, because the CTI team was kind of new. So I sort of went in as the principal threat intelligence analyst at that point. So that was enabled. So I worked directly with the head of threat intelligence to kind of mold and shape where the team was heading. So whilst he did all the boring admin stuff, I got to look at the technical bits and try and figure out how we could make best use of our budget and what tools we probably need to enable us to get the right answers. And that was really fun, because I got to work across so many different subject areas, which as a traditional CTI analyst you might not think about.
Okay.
So things like fraud, content piracy, and being able to sort of embellish and enable those teams by effectively making really good use of open source intelligence. So looking at piracy on forums, and then being able to bring that extra knowledge of, okay, well, if you have these bits of information about this person that's selling accounts, we can do these bits of research to potentially find out who they are. And I think some of that was really, really well received, and it sort of helped the piracy team sort of kick on a little bit as well. And and enabling those relationships, and sharing tradecraft, and occasionally we'd do little workshops where this is how we do this, and they're able to sort of take that away as well and use that information. So I think that's always been really interesting. And then by that point, being in a fairly senior role in terms of the threat intelligence team, also being able to do that mentoring piece with newer analysts, and that was great. We'd get a lot of interns and apprentices, and they're trying to figure out what they may want to do with the rest of their career.
Nice. Or
at least in the shorter term, what they'd like to do once they finished all their placements, and being able to sort of give them those skills and that understanding, and sort of help shape them and help them grow from what is a computer, not quite that bad, but if you go what is Google to and now an OSINT ninja, was always really, really rewarding.
Nice. Yeah.
So it was a really long way into how I end up in CTI.
And I think it's fair to say that you have a fair amount of exposure to both paid intel, but also into OSINT tools and frameworks and mindset. How would you describe the main differences between OSINT and traditional paid intel, for example?
Yeah, sure. That's a really good question. And so I guess over the last 7 or 8 years, having worked across quite a few different teams and in different roles and functions as well. So when I left Sky, I ended up being a CTI team lead at a tech startup in the UK. And that was a very different area of focus. And I think it was I'd already sort of done that intelligence requirements piece I mentioned earlier whilst working at Sky, and trying to figure out actually what's the business really care about. Because if we're spending time writing reports that we think are interesting and nobody reads them, or takes no value out of it, then we're just wasting our time.
Yeah.
At least this way, if they tell us, weirdly, when I did that the first time, ransomware wasn't that important on the list. People were like, oh yeah, I guess it's interesting. But it was there was other things that they seemed to really want more information on, which took us by surprise. And I think like even today I'd be like, no, ransomware's number one. Like, come on, calm yourself down.
Yeah.
But sort of taking like that Intel requirements work and fleshing that out, then running into a completely different role in a tech startup and working like an interesting space. They have a like quantum encryption solution, which is an interesting space with very sort of interesting and varied sort of like set of potential threat actors. And that was like using collectively probably quite a different range of tools as well, because the company was kind of small and budgets were restricted. We had to be really selective about what tools we would make use of to sort of enable that work. And invariably, the thing we wanted to know most about, I guess, as a company, was effectively like what's being said about the company online, and how can we sort of monitor that, and how do we leverage that information to help us understand where potential risks lie, what potential threats. So it was really interesting. And you start using like social listening tools, which usually you'd use in a marketing context, right?
Yeah.
Because like I want to know about what people are saying about our brand. How's our like current campaign doing?
Yeah.
Like, do people like us? But using that with like an intelligence angle is now something that I actually offer through my own company. I was like, this is actually a really interesting way of doing like brand monitoring, and I think it's something that you probably should be doing as a company, like when you're looking at threat intelligence. So with that in mind, and having like a fairly small budget for tools, so we couldn't go in and buy like threat feeds for 6 figures. The money wasn't there. I think in total our budget was well, it was definitely way under $100,000. Like, it was significantly smaller, but we had certain databases and accesses that we needed. So we talked to Moody's, who have the Bureau van Dijk, the business data set. That was one of the things we ended up buying access to, which is a phenomenal resource. Like, it was certainly not cheap, and I think for an individual researcher, it's way out of budget. But when you compare it to trying to find information about companies and ultimately who owns them and things like that, it was a phenomenal resource to have access to. We also leveraged like Multigo Enterprise, as it was then. That was really powerful as well, because not only do you have access to a phenomenal link analysis tool, but data allowances that came with that as well. So you can enable investigations and have access to some of these premium data sets without having to interact directly with the vendor and like pay them X many thousands of dollars a month or a year to get access to some of that data, which, when the number of inquiries and sort of bits of research we were doing, it was just, you couldn't justify that expense. It was like, actually, these 10 lookups a month for our use case here is actually sufficient, which is quite an interesting place to be, compared to like being in those environments where, oh yeah, this client has bought like everything. If there's a vendor, they bought them. And then it's like you're inundated with data, versus now we're doing very tailored and bespoke reports that are very like laser focused around particular topics or particular threats. So that was really interesting. And with that, you come to sort of rely on a lot of the open source tools and techniques that you can leverage from any number of GitHub repositories, where somebody has a tool that you can make use of. A lot of the stuff like I would use now, whilst I probably have a commercial solution for a lot of them, but there was tools like Holohy, which would take an email address and then find account associations that were linked to that email address.
Okay.
But now you have tools like OSINT Industries, Epios, Predict to Search, Castric Clues. Like there's a bunch now where you can do those same things, and the tools because they obviously they're commercialized, and they've taken like what effectively like was that idea, put it on steroids, And now it's not only a case of I can say, oh, this email address has a Google account. It's now I can see that these are the details for that Google account, or a LinkedIn account and Strava and all that other stuff. So when you're doing like people-focused research, that can be super powerful. And one of the things I do a lot of is person of interest investigations. So those tools are really, really helpful for that. But it comes back to the paid versus like, I guess, OSINT tools. The trade-off is always about the legwork that you have to do, right? So whilst some of the tools that you can leverage will have like a Multigo transform, so you can still use like your commercial tools, and then that you might have access to a Multigo, and you can bring in that open source solution, and you can still sort of use that data together. Most of them don't. So invariably, it's always the case. The trade-off is, right, I can bring this data in, but it's either going to be messy, or it's going to be up to you as an analyst to identify what's useful in there, what aids your investigation or helps you answer the intelligence requirement, versus I've just got all the data and here it is.
Yep.
I think the trade-off you get there, obviously, with, I'd say, if you do something like CrowdStrike, for example, like they might do an investigation based off some either an incident response they've done or one of analyst teams has done like open source research on. But when you get that report and you get the associated data, it's already been curated for you, right? So it's like, ta-da, here's what happened, here's the analysis, this is what we think, here's all the supporting information that you can then take and you can do your own research and verify or pivot from. And that's a huge time save, and especially in a high-paced environment where you might have like a team that anytime you see about a ransomware attack or you get like an instant response report or something, like just send it, and that's you as an analyst then don't have to do all that research. So I think the trade-off really is the time, but at the same time I think you can also learn a lot from the tools. So, and I think where I mentioned those like email, phone number lookup tools.
Yep.
I think before, like the first one was on GitHub, not many people knew like quite the extent of how much of that you could do. There were definitely like within the OSINT community, there was definitely like tradecraft and knowledge sharing about, oh, you can do this on this account, you can do this on this account. But we're talking maybe 3, 4, 5 accounts, like, or platforms that you knew that this trick would work on. And then you get a tool that gives you like 30 plus, and you're like, oh, this is actually a really viable technique that we should probably make better use of. And not only that, like at least 4 or 5 years ago, you'd be able to potentially find other bits of information to do that. A lot of the platforms have now changed that with like privacy and security laws and stuff. But you could like put in a username, and then sometimes you'd get the email address, or you can use the email address and you'd get the username or the phone number that was like associated with one of those accounts. And now you can still kind of do that. Invariably, it's not very often that you get like from an email address directly to a full phone number, but you might get a partial number. And if you've already got another bit of information, that might help correlate something for you or not. Or also go, oh, that's an interesting thing that we didn't know about, so now we have to go and research that. So I think the power and the beauty of those open source tools is you get people that are creative or curious, and they build something, share it with the community, and then people are able to take that and then develop it further and turn it into something which now is like it's in an own industry, right? It's there's a handful of these tools that exist. They all have like pros and cons, and as analysts, we're blessed that we have this choice as well of where we might go.
It feels like because the community is kind of actually doing the hands-on work, ends up seeing like a need or a necessity to have something to automate part of those manual processes, and then create something more rudimentary or something like that. And then if it gets popular, then probably, a company or somebody with deep pockets will pick that and try to develop into a more sophisticated, like paid platform. So it feels like the community aspect can actually bring the need first, and then just release something because it's a day-to-day need for somebody, or for a type of role. And from there, the industry might keep an eye on it to expand it to like a paid Intel platform or something.
No, for sure. And likewise, there's like when you take like a bleeping computer report, or something from the record, or ZNet if they still do for cyber reports. But quite often, like, you find like researchers, particularly on like, I'd say Twitter, but probably less nowadays. More of like Blue Sky, maybe LinkedIn a little bit. But researchers taking like what if you get in for one of these reports that you'll read on one of the news sites, pivoting on some of that information and finding more information as well. And it's one of those things that, sure, a lot of people have their opinions on Twitter as a platform now versus what it was a couple of years ago. But you still have to use that platform, because there's still a wealth of information being shared there that can be very, very useful in a intelligence context. And there are some guys out there do a lot of research around like command and control servers and things like that, and you can just like see like on a almost daily basis when they post something like, oh, this is a graduate report, I pivoted from here and here's a bunch of more of like indicators that weren't in the report and probably haven't been like identified yet as malicious. And I think that, and there's a tool by a guy called Monty Security called C2 Tracker, which is available on GitHub, and it's a Python script which effectively queries, I think, Shodan and Census, but it's got like almost like the methodology for identifying the command and control servers. So you can get like, every time you run the script, you can get a list of effectively like indicators of attack that you can be pretty confident are linked to something malicious. Because you've got this like curated search, which is high fidelity enough that you'd probably include it as suspect indicators, and you can then ingest those into SIEM, your EDR or whatever, and you can be like very proactive in blocking things before an attack occurs, right? Which, bearing in mind, that's a tool you can download for free, and if you've got a Shodan API key, probably not so much Census anymore, because they've changed their license models. But if you've got like a Shodan API key, and they often do like the $5 sale once or twice a year, like you can use this tool and have this information, which some vendors will charge you through the nose for this like just indicator feed. And quite often you'll find that you're probably finding things that they're not including for one reason or another. So I think that's where the real power of like the open source intelligence can come in, because if you rely solely on a third party, you're beholden to what visibility they have and what data they have access to. And that's dangerous, right? Because when you think, we're all human analysts, and if depending on what we're doing on any given day, you get distracted for a moment, and suddenly you forget to change a query to look at something else. You might get like a partial subset of data, or you might miss something, or data could be incorrect for one reason or another. But you'd have no way of knowing that if you're solely reliant on like one list. So being able to leverage that information that we can get from, whether it's like a Twitter post, whether it's from reading somebody's blog, whether it's from using tools like C2 Tracker, and you can review the code in there, and you can sort of see what the logic is for the search queries. and you can work backwards from that. I'll give a shout out here to, there's a researcher called, I'm going to butcher his surname, Michael Koshawara. I think he's a Polish guy. Does a lot of really, really good research around adversary infrastructure. He has an online course for this, and it's phenomenal. Like, it walks you through like exactly how to like pivot and research these things using different tools and looking at it from different angles. So I'd highly recommend anyone sort of checking that out, because it's taught me a lot, and I'd understood like the logic of how you would do this sort of research. But one of the things is always like, yeah, but how can you like know? There's always like, I can play around with the IP address and then look at different things, but like maybe I'm just clicking and getting somewhere like at random. But being able to sort of work through like structured examples that are, it's real life. The downside is obviously infrastructure comes and goes. So sometimes you'll be working through on the exercises and like the IPs don't exist exactly as you're supposed to be following it through. But, then you can switch to a different tool which might have the historical data and you can still see the information. But I think like if you can get your head around doing that kind of proactive OSINT research and investigation, which effectively is all it is, right? Because sure, you might need access to a platform, but most of the like IoT internet search engines will allow you to have a free account, will allow you to search using their web interface. So maybe like the API access is, prohibitively expensive, or, is not available, but you can still do this research, albeit manually. And I think if you can do that and then cross-reference that with the data you get from commercial providers, you have a really powerful like level of knowledge. And then if you're doing that and you're blocking things before they can be used against you, I think that's almost like the gold standard for any threat intelligence team, really, where they want to be.
Yeah.
Which can be really difficult. And also, like, you can track these things over time as well. So you can sort of see, right, last week it was all redline steal. It was like the most prevalent thing we were seeing. Whereas this week, that's dropped off, and now it's this, like, bit of malware. And being able to do that across, like, ransomware groups, APTs, different stealer, malware, like being able to identify those trends and things over time can be really powerful. Like, you can then bring that into like a strategic report if you do those every like 6 months or something, or every year. Like, this is what we saw over the course of the year in terms of trends and numbers.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really powerful addition as well into your whole like mindset and approach.
Agreed. And you mentioned something, double checking or cross referencing. Do you think it's fair to say that OSINT would be like a good complement or filling some gaps of the traditional threat intelligence from like traditional or paid vendors?
Yeah, I think as a threat intelligence analyst, you have to understand, and I think in a lot of ways, how you can get the data, what the data means, and therefore how you can use it in an intelligence product. So I think fundamentally, the idea that like OSINT and CTI are different fields is not really the case. There are parts of CTI which aren't OSINT because it relies on like a network sharing group, or it relies on other information, or like commercial vendors providing this information. But I think fundamentally what we're all doing is researching things that we're finding on the internet, which is almost to the letter definition of what OSINT is. Maybe like, and I think I touched heavily there around like adversary infrastructure, but that's like the approach to that and the methodology for that is completely almost the same as what you would do if you were researching where to buy like technology at a cheap price, like, or how to researching like an individual's online footprint. Like the approach, the methodologies, and a lot of the techniques are going to be the same. Sure, the subject matter might be different and the platforms might be different, but you still need that sort of analytical approach. You still need to be curious, and you still need to have that investigative mindset. And whilst looking at file hashes and like IPv6 addresses will like melt most people's eyes, like, which is fine. Like, it's not that different from doing research on other types of data. And I think depending on where your skills lie, I think there's so much you can do with some of that technical information to really enable investigations. And if you're really good at like image geolocation, like maybe that doesn't quite fit into like a CTI bucket until it does, where, you know, oh, this threat actor's uploaded a picture or something and well, this looks like this, and then what information could you find? So I think there's so much crossover in different, almost different disciplines, and yet so many, like everything that you consider to be like a huge difference, it's probably not really that significant. Like all that really changes is like the subject matter. Everything else more or less stays the same. If you're doing research into actors on the dark web, your tradecraft, your approach is going to be probably exactly the same as researching like IP addresses in Shodan. Like, and then thinking, right, well, what else can I find out here? Oh, I'm going to query this source and see what information I can get. Or, all right, I'll go to this tool now and see what that information provides. Like, unless you're just clicking around wildly and hoping for the best and, you know, YOLOing to a known malicious server and seeing what happens to your work computer. Don't do that. Like, largely, I think the methodology in your approach will always be the same, because we'll always have like the operational security OPSEC in the back of our heads that, okay, we need to protect ourselves for this reason. I'm researching this and I know it's bad, and I don't want like the villain on the other end to understand that we're looking at them, because we don't want them to target us, or we don't want them to know that we're aware of whatever they did. So I think all those approaches, they're always the same.
Okay, awesome. And so you mentioned a lot about you know, open source tools, paid tools as well, how they, you know, complement each other or can fill some of the gaps the other will have. And you also give the example, you know, working with a low budget kind of approach. And I think a lot of companies will have unique needs. You mentioned branding as well, monitoring. But do you think at any point we could have like a 1, 2, or 3 must-have tools for any CTI or OSINT teams?
That's a really good question. Pick the top 3.
Or one, you name it. It could be one. Again, I know every company will have different scenarios, but maybe one tool is like, regardless of the scenario, like a must have for everybody.
Yeah, so again, I know that this is in the process of change as well, but I think the one constant that I've always seen has been VirusTotal. That's always, for a CTI team, access to like VirusTotal intelligence is almost, it should be like a God-given right. Like, this is the one thing we actually need. I don't know what that's going to look like now, because it's in the process of the licenses are changing and the models changing. It's all going under like the Google threat intelligence banner. But that's always been one of those tools where it's like that we fundamentally need this. I think in line with that as well, like particularly for myself, I've always loved like link analysis and the visualizations that enables. So either you need a tool like Multigo or i2 Analyst Notebook, or you need like a platform which will give you some of those visualizations. Because I think for me, being able to see those links between like different data sources, particularly, and seeing like how the information all pans out, I think it's such a powerful and useful visual aid as an investigator that like it's almost like sinful that you wouldn't have access to that, because putting everything in like a spreadsheet doesn't quite have the same impact, I find, at least for me. Like, I know there's probably some like geniuses out there that just love looking at file hashes in a spreadsheet, but that's unfortunately not me. But and that's one of those multi-use is one of those tools that since I've been self-employed, like it's been like the first thing I like paid for access to. It's because it's just so powerful and it enables me to get to a point with an investigation, whether I know if I'm like looking at something like a scoping exercise, or if I'm looking at it, working through it step by step in investigation, it gives me that full flow of things that I need to see, and then I can leverage all the data sources I have access to make sure we've got the whole picture to enable that investigation. And whether that's like person of interest work, or if that's like cyber incident response and sort of threat intelligence research, security research, like the fact you can do all this in one place, I found is always really, really powerful. And to bring this back to the topic of open source as well, there's a UK security specialist called Daniel Card he's vibe coding he says like a Multigo replacement. I think he's like kind of adjusted his use case a little bit, but I think at the moment he's stuck with the name Crime Mapper, and he's vibe coded the whole thing, and it's really quite impressive. Like, it's like I'm just telling it what to do, and it does it, and then when it doesn't work, he shouts at it, and then once it gets back to where it needs to be, and I think I think we're all leveraging AI in one way or another at the moment. Like leveraging large language models for document summaries and all that stuff. But like seeing like stuff like that coming out, and again, like if you can't afford a Multigo license, there are a couple of options out there where you can still do this kind of research and analysis, and particularly from a CTI angle. The tool that Dan has built, it will. I think you can plug in like a Showdown API, URL scan, and a couple of others as well. So you can still like, if your focus is purely on like threat intelligence research, it's probably going to get you quite a long way there. For what you'd actually want to be able to query and how you'd want to leverage that data. So it's well worth a look. And especially as like code's all on GitHub. I think he's also got like a web version where you can just go and play with it.
Okay. And if we're thinking about data breaches, for example, any tools, frameworks, approach to attack surface intel that you would recommend?
Yeah, so it's very much like top of my mind. I think so my company Prospective Intelligence, we do attack surface intelligence. That's kind of how I coined it. But effectively it's using open source intelligence to enable companies to understand like the external attack surface by effectively taking that point of view of, if I was going to target you, what can I see? And what could I use to do bad things? So, and I think, so our focus is at the moment very much like UK small, medium businesses, kind of where we position ourselves at the moment. Mostly because I think that's a hugely underserved market when it comes to not just cyber threat intelligence, but cybersecurity in general. Mostly because, they don't tend to be big ticket. They don't tend to be like companies that you can spend 6 months trying to cultivate a 6-figure deal out of. It's, it's very small. It's a very big market, but very underserved by the major players in like the threat intelligence space. And I think the approach we've taken there is, if you follow like basic cyber hygiene and you do the basic things that the National Cybersecurity Center has said you should do, like as a company, and invariably it's like use a password manager, use multi-factor authentication. Like if we do just those two things, we're going to reduce the likelihood of you being successfully exploited, right? Significantly. I think Microsoft said it was something like, if you use MFA, you beat 99% of attacks.
Yeah.
And I don't believe their numbers, but it's a high number.
Yeah.
I think, right?
Yeah.
If you just made it that much harder to get in, then opportunistic attacks become less likely to succeed.
Yeah. Patching.
So our approach there is, very much like if you can do these basic things right, apply software updates, especially when there's something bad. If you use password manager, use MFA, then if we can find all the things that exist like outside of where you might have visibility. So if you've got a couple of security tools that are doing some sort of monitoring inside your network, if we can find the things that are outside your area of control, then if we can get ahead of those and either mitigate them or clarify that, oh, that's actually not a problem, or that, oh yeah, that needs fixing, then I think we're probably going to get you significantly further down the road of avoiding being a victim of cybercrime than where we started.
Yeah.
And I think for most companies, that really starts with, do you understand what a data breach is? And secondly, when they say, yeah, I have an idea what that is, we look to have I been pwned once? We then say, right, have you ever heard of information stealer malware? At which point most companies, most reasonable human beings go, I haven't got a clue what that means. So that, and then it's trying to educate people around what is effectively a fairly subtle difference, because for all intents and purposes, your credentials are stolen over here in a breach. Your credentials are stolen here and by malware. Sounds like the same thing. But getting businesses to understand that a stealer malware is much more dangerous, because a data breach is always like a point in time, right? So something was posted on breach forums this week, and the breach happened 3 years ago, and one of your corporate email addresses is inside it. The likelihood is that person probably doesn't work here anymore, or if they have, they've probably changed their password by now. You'd hope, potentially.
Yeah.
Whereas when you get the stealer malware, obviously there's a market there in the underground to buy those credentials. And not only that, those credentials regularly get shared for free. I mean, at the moment, as we're recording this, less so on Telegram, because Telegram are in the process of nuking a lot of those channels.
Yeah.
But no doubt, they'll reappear, or they'll move to a different platform.
Yeah.
And those credentials will contain, like, literally corporate email address, Microsoft 365 login, password, or HR portals, business internal systems. And we've worked with clients before where that has been the root cause of a ransomware attack. So understanding that, as security professionals, we can collect this data too. Secondly, that when we collect the data, we need to be able to process it. And the aim here is, as soon as we're able to identify that one of your corporate email addresses appears in something, particularly if it's like stealer malware or a phishing kit, that's a sign of a real compromise that needs like immediate response. Because somebody's either clicked on a link and submitted their details, and they're probably accurate details, or somebody has a malware infection, which could be on a corporate device, but is most likely on a personal device, which makes it even that much harder for you to detect it using any manner of security tools. And I mean, I know in this space, most people know like how stealing malware works, but I think getting companies to understand that if you allow people to log into their web browser using their personal account, and they're doing that at home, that the corporate credentials are then shared between those two devices, and that's how the corporate credentials are breached. Like, it's really like kind of nuanced difference from getting them to understand how data breach works, and how a data breach affecting a third party, so it's not them that has to worry about cleaning it up. Like, it's a really powerful but nuanced difference. So I think using open source intelligence to enable that investigation, and in fact, we're automatically collecting the data and processing it and checking for customer credentials. I think that's fundamentally the cornerstone of what the external attack surface really is. Because sure, we could then have a look at like what servers you have that are internet facing, and you might find that there are some vulnerabilities on them. But And again, invariably, when we look at that, what do we care about the most? It's either, is it a vulnerability that we know is exploitable?
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's like the CISA Kev list or on other like, but yeah, so vulncheck.com has their own like known exploited vulnerability list, which differs from CISA's in that it's more expansive.
Mm-hmm.
So more inclusive of vulnerabilities that have exploits available. So also, first, like priority lists are, right, is it on a known exploited vulnerability list, or is the EPSS like significantly high? Because that often indicates the likelihood of the attack is in the next 30 days that vulnerability will be exploited, right? So if we find vulnerabilities on an internet-facing asset that we think are either going to be exploited or we know exploits exist, and you know, especially when there's like code on GitHub that anyone could effectively run, we take that information, and now if we find compromised credentials, particularly from like a stealer log, suddenly we're starting to form this picture of this is how you probably would get an initial access.
Yeah, explosive mix.
So taking that approach, and then also touching on those other things, so like the brand monitoring piece around brand sentiment. Is there anything about your company which is causing like negative press, which, you know, if you're not aware of, maybe you should be, or if you are aware of it, like let's look at it from this angle and see if there's anything from a cyber aspect that we should be aware of. And then also all the traditional bits like, okay, well, where else is information about your company online? Has your company been mentioned, like, let's say on the dark web, quote unquote, but invariably on forums is largely what people mean by that. So can we cover like any dark web results that we do find? Is your company included in documents that are being shared on like ransomware data leak sites or stuff like that? Any information that might be useful to a criminal. And then the other piece we do is around almost like brand protection. So phishing, typo squat domains, and brand imagery.
Okay.
Right. So can we find, you know, obviously domains that look to be mimicking like your company or parts of your company, and then subsequently, if a domain is very similar to yours, does it contain your logos or like your favicon icon? Like, so we can be pretty sure that it might be a phishing attack. And obviously with that is also, does this website have a mail server like running? Because it's always like, okay, this looks like it's definitely targeting you. There's a mail server. It's probably going to be used to send phishing emails. And like this web page is covered in your logos. Good chance that that's going to be used for some kind of spear phishing attack. And sort of taking that approach to like attack surface management, which I think goes beyond like what a lot of traditional tools do, where it's around like assets and open ports and IPs, and we still do all that because, you know, it is fundamentally important. But I think by bringing that open source intelligence piece to it, taking that step back and being a bit more like, I'd say, criminal minded, I guess. Like if I take this approach that if I wanted to do bad things to your company, this is how I would look to do it. And then offering that sort of ongoing monitoring support so the company can sort of feel at peace with that if something does get identified, and because also like very much in that space of it's human analysts doing the work and it's a human written report. So everything that does get sent to a client has been assessed as probably worth your time. Or we've disregarded this, even though you'll probably see this, we disregard it for these reasons. So I think being able to give that contextualized approach to looking at the data is really important. But fundamentally, what it really does come down to is like the bulk of this revolves around credentials and if your credentials are being stolen or not.
Got it. Thanks for sharing the story with us. And I often ask that to all the guests. Do you think there's like any skills or anything you know today that you wish you knew back in a day when you decided to pivot to CTI?
Yeah, maybe don't.
Yeah.
I jest. I think, but the most important thing I think I look at now, and the approach that I tend to take, is always around establishing the intelligence requirements, and being clear about what it is that you need to deliver, whether that's like our areas of focus, ransomware, nation state, and this script kiddie in this place who just seems to have it out for us, or if it's like specific questions that you're being asked by like the SOC, the CISO, the board. And I think the second thing that is really important to me, and I think is probably one of those things that has to be better understood, is that a cyber threat intelligence team doesn't necessarily have to work solely to the SOC.
Okay.
And I think a lot of companies get into this trap where, well, you do cyber, they do cyber, you do the intelligence bit to whatever they want. Whereas the threat intelligence team really needs to be working from almost like the board down, is where the direction, because the threat intelligence team should be understanding what the business is doing and where the business is heading, and how when we write a report and we say, oh, we absolutely shouldn't be doing this, this is foolish, there might well be a business reason why we're putting a data center over here in a country that you might think is stupid or like preposterous. You have to understand like what the business is doing to then be able to really support the business properly. So you can spend all day writing reports about ransomware groups, or people are posting on forums, but at the end of the day, the job of the CTI team usually is to help protect the business from cyber attack. And you can't really do that if you don't really understand what the business is trying to do, what the business's priorities lie. And I think it's hard, because getting FaceTime with CISO in a large company is going to be difficult, right? As a threat intelligence team, probably hard, especially when it boils down to understanding priorities and like the strategic direction of the company. But ultimately, if you don't know those pieces of information, you can't really do the job to the best extent, I think. Perfect. So I think understanding that, because I mentioned earlier about how sometimes we'd write reports that we thought were cool. And I think this is kind of when I worked at Sky, why we ended up establishing what the intelligence requirements process, because quite often we'd write a report and we'd think like, yeah, this is really interesting, really cool. And, obviously we should be caring about like this threat actor or whatever. But that's because we've made that decision and that assessment based on our knowledge, and not because we ever sat down and asked like the people that read these reports what actually is important to them. So I think, and that's kind of where this really came from for me, was if you don't really understand your requirements or the direction of the business and the business's priorities, then you can't really provide the best quality reports, and you might spend a lot of time writing reports on things that never get read or never get actioned, because ultimately the business doesn't care, or it's just not a priority because the priorities are in other areas.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think it's fair to say at this point that every single guest, in one way or the other, we touched on the importance of not only having the technical skills, but how to communicate that in a way that the company understand what it's actually aligned with the company goals and needs and all that. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of bits and bytes, right? So
no,
we
100%.
cannot do that.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally, like, communication obviously is effectively, that's what we do, right? We are communicators. So we'll take the data and we'll goblin away on like some research, and effectively one way or another we end up creating a product. And that can be, it can be a long form report, it can be a couple of lines in an email, it can be a beautiful diagram, it can be a slideshow, it can be a verbal briefing, it can be any of these things. It can be an interpretive dance. But yeah, I think, and I guess that's probably the third thing I would say is like, yeah, you have to be comfortable taking what can be a deeply technical piece of information and being able to convey that in a way that the audience either A, will understand, or B, can make good, what's the word I'm looking for, effectively take good actions from. And I think that can be really hard, because you often read like, and I'm not a coder by any stretch, so reading like a technical breakdown of like a particular piece of malware, I struggle to read those reports, because it's when it goes into the minutiae of like, this is what this bit of the code does, and then you can see that this happens, and then this and this, and I'm like, I don't see that. I'm taking your word for it.
Yeah.
But what I can do is sort of get the gist of what this report is telling me, and understand what that means within the business context. And I'm probably not going to send a CISO like one of these malware reports unless I'm trying to get fired, right? There you go, read that.
Yeah.
But or I'm not going to send that to the board. Like, here's a 28-page breakdown about this malware line by line, because I mean, A, they're never going to read it, and secondly, it's completely the wrong type of thing to send to that group. So understanding your audience and being able to communicate to them the right information at the right level should be, it's like intelligence 101, really. And I feel lucky, because my background coming from an intelligence community, it was like always like, that's exactly just how we do business. And I think particularly now, like as junior analysts come in, you might not ever have that exposure, or you might not have the seniority in the team that might have had that experience. So I think there's always a risk that could get missed. I think I was very fortunate, like I've never really come across that myself to date. But I think as the industry has matured, and as threat intelligence has become an industry, we still need to make sure that we're doing the right things fundamentally. And I think, like in the OSINT space, there's a lot of very engaged and very keen people that are new to this space. And so we talk a lot around in training courses to deliver around understanding what the tools can give you. And you can download a script from GitHub and it will blow your mind with the information it will bring back. And you're like, just like, I can't believe that this was free, or this took me 2 minutes, or it used to take me days. But I think we fall into this trap, particularly in the chasing like the shiny, that we'll use these tools, we'll get a load of data back, and then we'll call that intelligence. And fundamentally what we need to be doing is, putting the intelligence part into the OSINT. So doing the analysis, figuring out like either our hypotheses around what the data is indicating, or what it's proving or disproving, and fundamentally how we answer those intelligence requirements. Because it's always okay to turn back to somebody that's either asked you a question that they think this means this bit of information, can you prove it? And to turn around to them and say, well, no, because the data says, the data here we've analyzed and it all indicates something completely different. And that can be a really good example of that, I think, was like the Olympic destroyer malware from the Winter Olympics. Must be probably 6-7 years ago now. Whereas like when that story broke and like the attack happened, everyone's immediately, it's like, oh, North Korea did this. And it wasn't until somebody, you get teams actually sat down doing the analysis and actually working through things and looking at those hypotheses and figuring things through, where you turn and go, no, that's not the case. There are all these other indicators which indicate a completely different scenario. Obviously, I think that was attributed to the GRU in Russia, I think. But I think that's fundamentally, I think, when we talk about communication, disseminating reports, understanding the audience, what they're expecting and being able to pitch at the right level is such a invaluable skill, because you could take that, you could leave threat intelligence behind forever, but if you can still do that, like I can take this thing, I can convey it to whoever, and they will get it, or they can make use of that information, then you can go and probably work in any industry and use those skills immeasurably, because that's such an important life skill. You know, and especially if you can take something that's complicated and effectively distill it down to something that like a 5-year-old could effectively understand, at least at a high level, then we're doing the right job.
Really cool. Aaron, thank you so much for coming to the show. Really appreciate all the many insights, really insightful conversation. And I hope I'll see you around.
Oh, thanks so much, Pedro. It's been great chatting to you, and I really enjoyed it.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this episode valuable, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Got thoughts or questions? Connect with us on our LinkedIn group, Cyber Threat Intelligence Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. If you know anyone with CTI expertise that would like to be interviewed in the show, just let us know. Until next time, stay sharp and stay secure.